In the last decades of the 19th century, the Harrington family name was printed often in Boston's society pages, tied to philanthropy, commerce, and discreet political connections. By 1888, that same name began to vanish from public record, removed from registries, omitted from publications, and absent from gatherings they once hosted. The disappearance was not sudden, but calculated, leaving only a few scattered mentions in obscure ledgers. The reasons, sealed in official archives, would be pursued only in private whispers by those who noticed. The Harringtons were widely regarded as a stabilizing influence in Boston's civic life. Their estate in the Back Bay was both a residence and a meeting place for prominent figures in business and local governance. They contributed to hospitals, libraries, and cultural institutions, earning commendations from municipal boards. In official records, their transactions appeared orderly, their charitable work publicly praised. Yet the meticulous image contrasted sharply with untraceable financial transfers, sudden resignations from oversight committees, and missing entries in government reports. For a family so embedded in the city's structure, the silence around their name after 1888 was as conspicuous as their earlier prominence. The prominence of the Harrington family in Boston during the final quarter of the 19th century was not solely the result of inherited wealth. Their influence was constructed through a careful alignment of civic involvement, business acumen, and a public persona that appeared both benevolent and pragmatic. Contemporary newspaper columns often described the family's approach to civic duty as exemplary, highlighting their ability to bridge the spheres of commerce and public service. For residents who relied on the stability of established names, the Harringtons seemed to embody a form of reliability that the rapidly changing city required. Their principal residence on Commonwealth Avenue was known for its restrained grandeur. The facade, built in pale limestone imported from New England quarries, stood in contrast to the ornate designs preferred by some of their contemporaries. Visitors noted the absence of excessive ornamentation, a choice often interpreted as evidence of the family's reserved tastes. The household staff maintained the grounds with precision, ensuring that every aspect of the property reflected order and careful management. This visible discipline extended into their other ventures, from the operation of textile interests to their involvement in urban planning committees. It was common for Boston's Board of Trade to consult with the Harrington patriarch on matters concerning shipping routes and warehouse construction. Archival correspondence reveals that his recommendations were often adopted without modification. He was regarded as a figure whose judgment was based on practical understanding rather than personal ambition. In municipal meetings, his voice carried weight, yet he rarely sought public recognition for contributions. This understated manner only reinforced the perception of integrity. The family also cultivated connections with academic institutions. Several members served as trustees for local colleges, participating in discussions on curriculum development and funding strategies. Reports from these institutions often credit the Harringtons with introducing policies that balance traditional education with the emerging needs of industrial commerce. Students from modest backgrounds occasionally benefited from scholarships funded quietly through the family's charitable accounts. The recipients were rarely informed of the source, a practice that aligned with the Harringtons' preference for discretion. Their reputation was further enhanced through consistent participation in cultural endeavors. The Harrington matriarch maintained a seat on the advisory board of the Boston Athenaeum, contributing to the expansion of its rare book collection. Her name appeared in donor registries beside those of prominent scholars, yet she seldom attended the formal events organized to acknowledge benefactors. Instead, her correspondence with librarians focused on acquisition priorities, preservation methods, and the logistics of storing manuscripts in humidity-controlled conditions. These letters reveal a meticulous attention to detail, suggesting that her interest in cultural preservation was more than ceremonial. The younger generation of the family followed similar patterns of civic engagement. The eldest son oversaw a cooperative housing initiative designed to provide stable living arrangements for skilled laborers arriving from rural Massachusetts. While some critics accused the program of being a calculated attempt to secure political favor, there was little direct evidence to substantiate such claims at the time. Public records show that the housing developments were maintained to a higher standard than similar projects, with reliable access to utilities and routine inspections by city engineers. Business interests remained diverse yet interconnected. The Harringtons invested in textile mills located along the Merrimack River, ensuring a steady flow of goods to Boston's expanding port facilities. They also held significant shares in a regional railroad company, enabling them to influence freight rates and schedules. These strategic holdings allowed the family to coordinate supply chains in a manner that benefited both their enterprises and the city's commercial growth. Merchants appreciated the predictability of Harrington-managed routes, while civic officials valued the increased tax revenue generated by the efficient movement of goods. Archival minutes from Boston's Chamber of Commerce meetings during the early 1880s show multiple instances where the Harrington representatives proposed infrastructure improvements. These proposals, often accompanied by detailed cost analyses, typically passed without prolonged debate. Some of these projects included the modernization of dock equipment, the expansion of warehouse districts, and the introduction of standardized measurement protocols for imported materials. By embedding themselves in these decision-making processes, the Harringtons reinforced their position as indispensable contributors to the city's economic stability. Public perception was further shaped by their selective association with charitable causes. They were careful to support initiatives that were widely accepted across different sectors of society. For example, their donations to medical institutions focused on the acquisition of new equipment rather than direct involvement in contentious reforms. Annual reports from the Boston General Hospital list the Harringtons as consistent donors to its laboratory expansion, citing their interest in improving diagnostic capabilities. This choice of funding avoided the more politically charged debates surrounding healthcare access, allowing them to maintain broad public approval. The family also engaged in measured political participation. Rather than holding elected office, they preferred to influence policy through advisory roles and committee appointments. Records from the Massachusetts State House indicate that Harrington representatives provided written recommendations on topics such as tariff adjustments, industrial safety regulations, and public works funding. Their proposals often reflected a balance between commercial efficiency and civic responsibility, a combination that earned them the trust of multiple political factions. Despite their wide-ranging involvement, the Harringtons maintained a deliberate separation between their private affairs and their public persona. Invitations to their residence for business discussions were carefully curated, and guest lists were compiled with precision to ensure compatibility among attendees. Contemporary accounts suggest that these gatherings were conducted with an emphasis on formality, with topics confined to commerce, governance, and cultural preservation. Personal matters were seldom discussed, and social interactions were framed within the context of institutional advancement. It was within this carefully controlled environment that the family's standing became almost self-sustaining. New business ventures could rely on pre-established trust. Cultural projects received immediate credibility through their endorsement, and policy proposals gained legitimacy when associated with their name. By the mid-1880s, few public initiatives of significance in Boston proceeded without at least indirect input from the Harrington circle. However, beneath the steady outward appearance, there were indications of a more complex operational structure. Financial ledgers from the period reveal an unusual pattern of interlinked accounts spanning multiple institutions. Transactions were often routed through intermediary trusts, making it difficult to trace the flow of funds to their final destinations. While such arrangements were not uncommon among large families managing diverse holdings, the degree of segmentation within the Harrington accounts was notable. Bank clerks tasked with reconciling deposits and withdrawals sometimes recorded the need for additional documentation before finalizing entries. Property records also show a sequence of acquisitions and transfers that appear to have been coordinated across several years. Parcels of land in both urban and rural areas changed ownership between entities, in which the Harringtons held significant stakes. Many of these parcels remained undeveloped, suggesting that the purchases were intended for purposes beyond immediate commercial use. Survey maps indicate that some of these holdings aligned with planned but unannounced municipal projects, raising questions about how the family obtained advanced knowledge of city development plans. Their influence extended into media as well. Editors of certain periodicals routinely received early copies of municipal reports and commercial bulletins through channels linked to the Harrington offices. This access allowed them to shape coverage in ways that maintained favorable public sentiment toward projects the family supported. In some cases, stories highlighting potential inefficiencies in competing ventures appeared in print only after the Harringtons had secured their own contracts. While there was no official inquiry into these practices, the patterns suggest a calculated approach to information management. By late 1886, their integration into Boston's civic structure appeared complete. They had become an essential point of reference for commercial planning, cultural development, and municipal governance. This level of entrenchment made their subsequent disappearance from the public record all the more difficult to explain. The absence was not accompanied by scandal in the press, nor by official announcements of withdrawal from committees or boards. Instead, it was as though references to the Harringtons were gradually omitted from documents, meetings, and newsprint, replaced quietly with other names or left unmentioned altogether. The manner in which the Harrington name was woven into the administrative and commercial mechanisms of Boston made it difficult for observers to identify where influence ended and official authority began. City clerks who handled permits and authorizations often recorded that documents linked to Harrington interests moved through their offices with unusual speed. This efficiency was attributed publicly to the completeness and accuracy of the applications, yet the frequency with which they bypassed procedural delays suggested the presence of coordinated arrangements behind the scenes. Meeting notes from civic planning boards illustrate how the Harrington representatives often arrived with prepared materials that matched, in both language and formatting, the official summaries later distributed by the boards themselves. It is unclear whether these documents were drafted in collaboration with municipal staff or whether they simply anticipated the final versions with notable precision. Either way, their ability to align proposals with the eventual outcomes reinforced the impression that the family's guidance was a natural extension of the city's own decision-making processes. The social component of their influence was equally calculated. Invitations to seasonal gatherings at the Commonwealth Avenue residence were not issued widely, but those who attended represented a broad cross-section of the city's leadership. Industrialists, educators, legal advisors, and municipal officials found themselves in the same room, often engaging in discussions that touched on upcoming public works or legislative proposals. Although these events were framed as cultural or charitable in nature, guests frequently left with a clearer understanding of the Harrington perspective on certain matters. While most records of these gatherings are anecdotal, preserved in private letters and diaries, a few archived correspondences reveal the extent to which attendance could influence subsequent civic developments. One letter from a local shipping magnate to a colleague notes that following an evening at the Harrington home, a proposal to modernize wharf facilities received swift approval in committee. The letter makes no direct claim of cause and effect, but its placement in the timeline is difficult to overlook. The network extended beyond Boston's borders. The Harringtons maintained correspondence with contacts in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, exchanging information about trade conditions, freight tariffs, and investment opportunities. In several cases, these communications appear to have informed decisions within Boston's own commercial community, allowing the family to introduce external perspectives at precisely the right moment to guide policy in their favor. Their investments in infrastructure provided another avenue for influence. Railroad expansion projects that connected Boston to smaller industrial towns often benefited from early financial backing by Harrington-associated entities. This support was rarely advertised, but land acquisition records show that parcels along proposed routes were purchased months before public announcements of the projects. When the routes were finalized, these properties increased significantly in value, and many were later developed into warehouse or distribution facilities aligned with Harrington-managed enterprises. The family's engagement with Boston's maritime operations was particularly noteworthy. Shipping manifests and Port Authority records indicate that cargo linked to Harrington Ventures consistently cleared inspection in less time than comparable shipments. While no irregularities were officially reported, the statistical difference was significant. In an era when delays could mean substantial financial loss, this efficiency offered a competitive advantage that reinforced their position in the marketplace. Public institutions continued to benefit from their support, though even in philanthropy, there was evidence of strategic alignment. Endowments to libraries often coincided with expansions into neighborhoods where Harrington real estate interests were concentrated. Funding for public lectures and exhibitions tended to focus on themes related to trade, industry, and urban planning. These contributions were welcomed by the community, but their recurring alignment with the family's commercial priorities illustrates the interconnected nature of their civic and business activities. The Harrington approach to reputation management relied heavily on consistent presentation. Newspapers that reported on their charitable donations used language that echoed previous articles, suggesting that certain details were provided directly to the press rather than left to journalistic discretion. While not unusual for prominent families of the era, the level of uniformity in phrasing across different publications points to deliberate coordination. Educational affiliations also served as a platform for influence. Trusteeships at colleges and technical institutes allowed the Harringtons to recommend faculty appointments and curricular adjustments. Meeting transcripts from one technical college show that a proposal for an expanded engineering program, initially introduced by Harrington representatives, passed with little opposition. The program's focus on transportation infrastructure coincided with the family's interests in rail and shipping enterprises. Their presence in banking was less visible, but equally significant. While the Harringtons did not operate a bank of their own, they maintained substantial deposits across multiple institutions. Periodically, they shifted large sums between accounts in a manner that avoided public disclosure, but provided leverage in negotiations with financial partners. These movements were conducted through intermediaries, making it difficult to attribute them directly to the family without access to the underlying account documentation. Another layer of their influence emerged through quiet participation in arbitration and mediation processes. When disputes arose between competing commercial entities, Harrington associates were sometimes called upon to provide neutral assessments. In several recorded instances, their recommendations were accepted without further contest, effectively shaping the outcome in ways that aligned with their long-term interests. The breadth of their activities meant that the family's name appeared in a wide array of official documents, from shipping contracts to minutes of cultural society meetings. This presence was so consistent that its gradual disappearance from records after 1888 would later puzzle historians. In the years leading up to that point, there was no indication in public records of declining engagement. On the contrary, documents from 1887 suggest an even greater consolidation of their position. One of the more revealing sets of records from this period involves the transfer of several large tracts of land on the outskirts of Boston to a newly formed holding company. The company's listed officers were not publicly associated with the Harringtons, yet the financing originated from accounts tied to their commercial operations. These transactions were filed with all appropriate documentation, but the holding company dissolved within 18 months, and the properties reverted to other entities without passing through open market sales. The reasoning for this sequence remains unclear, though it suggests a level of planning that extended beyond ordinary investment strategy. The absence of public-facing scandal during this time is notable. Newspapers of the late 1880s that routinely covered the city's prominent families continued to mention the Harringtons in social and philanthropic contexts, with no suggestion of internal disputes or financial instability. Annual reports from civic organizations still listed their contributions, and their names remained on the rosters of committees and boards. There was, at least in outward appearance, no indication that their position was in jeopardy. Even their private correspondence from the period, preserved in fragments within archival collections, reflects the same measured tone found in their public dealings. Letters between family members discuss the progress of various projects, travel arrangements, and seasonal events. Business letters retain the same formal structure, with clear objectives and carefully chosen language. This consistency across both personal and professional communications speaks to the deliberate maintenance of a unified image. By the end of 1887, the scope of their engagement had reached a peak. The family was involved directly or indirectly in nearly every major commercial, cultural, and civic initiative in Boston. Their ability to navigate the intersecting interests of industry, politics, and public service had created a position from which they could shape the city's development without occupying formal office or drawing undue attention. It was a balance that appeared sustainable, at least from the perspective of contemporary observers. In early 1888, there were still multiple projects in progress bearing their endorsement. These included an initiative to expand the city's streetcar network, a proposal for a new public lecture series on industrial innovation, and an agreement to modernize a section of the port's warehouse district. Each of these ventures involved multiple stakeholders and had advanced far enough to suggest that completion was inevitable. Yet within a year, the family's name would be absent from the documentation of these same projects, replaced by other sponsors and administrators. In the early months of 1888, there were subtle indications that the Harrington family's position within Boston's civic and commercial structure was beginning to shift. These signs were not widely recognized at the time, and many passed unnoticed, even by those who regularly interacted with the family. They appeared as minor irregularities in documents, delays in correspondence, or alterations to meeting schedules that in isolation seemed inconsequential. Taken together, however, they formed a pattern that suggested the first stages of a withdrawal from public visibility. The most tangible evidence came from committee rosters and institutional records. Several boards on which the Harringtons had served for years quietly issued new lists of members in the spring of 1888, omitting their names without acknowledgement or explanation. In most cases, the official minutes recorded the changes as routine adjustments, the sort of administrative turnover that occurred when members relocated or declined reappointment. Yet no public statements were made by the Harringtons regarding their absence, and replacement members were often individuals with no prior connection to the committees in question. Correspondence between municipal offices and the Harrington estate also began to show irregularities. Letters that would previously have been addressed directly to a family member were now directed to clerks or assistants. In a few cases, these communications were returned with a note indicating that the recipient was unavailable for an indefinite period. There was no mention of travel, illness, or other conventional reasons for absence, only a polite acknowledgement that inquiries would be handled by alternate contacts. In commercial dealings, the shift was equally understated. Contracts that might have been negotiated in person by a Harrington representative were instead handled through intermediaries, sometimes firms with no public association to the family. Signatures on these agreements belonged to agents or trustees rather than the principal family members, and the language used in the documents lacked the distinct phrasing that had once been characteristic of Harrington agreements. This change in approach did not immediately affect the execution of the contracts, but it altered the visibility of the family's role in ongoing ventures. The change in their presence at public events was perhaps the most noticeable to the city's social circles. Seasonal gatherings at the Commonwealth Avenue residence, long regarded as fixtures of Boston's civic calendar, were suddenly cancelled without rescheduling. Announcements that typically appeared in society columns were absent. Invitations that had been extended months earlier were quietly withdrawn, sometimes through short notes that provided no explanation beyond the statement that the event would not proceed as planned. Financial records from this period reveal additional irregularities. Transfers between Harrington-associated accounts increased in frequency, often involving amounts that were modest enough to avoid public reporting, but significant when viewed cumulatively. These transfers were routed through institutions outside Boston more frequently than before, with a notable concentration in banks located in New York and Philadelphia. While it was not unusual for prominent families to diversify their financial holdings, the timing and scale of these movements suggest a deliberate effort to reposition assets. The family's interactions with cultural institutions also began to change. Contributions to libraries, museums, and educational programs, while still recorded, were increasingly made through anonymous donations or through third-party trusts. Annual reports that once listed the Harrington name among benefactors now referred to unspecified patrons. Curators and administrators, accustomed to regular communication with the family, reported fewer direct exchanges. In some cases, projects that had been discussed in detail with Harrington representatives were transferred to the oversight of other sponsors before completion. Archival notes from Boston's Port Authority during this time show that the expedited processing of shipments associated with the Harrington enterprises began to diminish. Cargo manifests still included goods from their ventures, but inspection times and clearance rates now aligned more closely with standard processing schedules. There is no record of disputes or compliance issues, yet the earlier pattern of prioritization ceased without comment. In the press, the shift was even more pronounced. Mentions of the family in newspapers and periodicals declined sharply in the months following the spring of 1888. When their name did appear, it was often in passing, attached to projects where their role was no longer central. Articles that once would have highlighted their contributions instead focused on other individuals or organizations. The uniform phrasing that had characterized earlier press coverage was absent, replaced by more generic descriptions that suggested a lack of direct editorial guidance from the family. Privately, some of the family's associates began to remark on the changes, though these observations were rarely committed to writing. A surviving letter from a member of the Boston Athenaeum Board to a colleague notes that the Harrington matriarch, previously a reliable presence at advisory meetings, had declined several invitations without explanation. The writer speculates on possible reasons, mentioning the possibility of extended travel, but acknowledges that no confirmation had been received. The withdrawal extended into their influence on policy discussions. Meetings at the Massachusetts State House that had once included Harrington representatives now proceeded without their input. Proposals that might have benefited from their strategic guidance were debated and decided without reference to their perspectives. Legislative Committee minutes from mid-1888 contain fewer mentions of recommendations or data provided by the family's offices. In the absence of direct participation, others began to occupy the space they had left. New figures emerged in civic and commercial leadership roles, many of them with limited prior experience, but with apparent access to resources that allowed them to step into projects once associated with the Harringtons. The speed with which these individuals assumed responsibilities suggests a degree of preparation, as though the transition had been anticipated and coordinated. The most unusual aspect of this shift was its consistency across so many different spheres. It was not confined to one sector of their activities, but appeared simultaneously in commerce, culture, and governance. This uniformity made it difficult to attribute the changes to ordinary fluctuations in fortune or interest. The absence of any public acknowledgement, combined with the steady redirection of their responsibilities, created a situation in which the family's presence could diminish without immediate public inquiry. Some archival sources suggest that the earliest recognition of this change came from within the financial sector. Notes in the ledger of a Boston trust company from mid-1888 refer to an inquiry by a senior partner into the altered disposition of certain accounts. The entry does not elaborate, but the phrasing implies that the pattern of deposits and withdrawals had shifted significantly. This observation appears alongside a reference to instructions for future correspondence to be routed through a New York address rather than the Commonwealth Avenue residence. Other signs emerged in the management of their real estate holdings. Properties in Boston that had been maintained at the highest standard began to show signs of reduced oversight. Maintenance contracts were renewed for shorter terms, and in some cases, new management firms were engaged without prior notice to tenants. Building registries note changes in the listed owners of certain parcels, often replacing the Harrington name with the names of holding companies registered outside Massachusetts. These changes were executed with full compliance to legal requirements, but the frequency and timing contributed to the broader perception of transition. Even within academic institutions, where the Harringtons had long been regarded as steadfast supporters, there was a quiet reduction in their involvement. Trustees' meeting minutes from a technical college indicate that while the family's seat on the board remained officially filled, the representative attended fewer sessions and abstained from votes on long-term initiatives. Scholarship funds associated with the family continued to be distributed, but without the additional endowments that had previously expanded their scope. By late summer of 1888, it was clear to those closely following Boston's civic affairs that the Harringtons were no longer operating with the same degree of visibility or engagement. Yet the change had occurred in such a gradual and measured way that it attracted no direct challenge or demand for explanation. In the public eye, they were still present, if less frequently seen. In official records, they were still acknowledged, if less prominently. The process by which their role diminished was almost entirely without disruption, leaving behind only a pattern of subtle omissions and understated substitutions. By the final months of 1888, the changes in the Harrington family's public and institutional presence had advanced far enough to be apparent in the city's formal records. Civic directories that had for years listed multiple family members in leadership roles now included only a single entry, placed toward the back of the volume without the elaborate annotations that had once accompanied their names. In the absence of any public statement, it was left to clerks and archivists to record the altered state of their involvement without explanation. City Council proceedings from October of that year provide a notable example. In the minutes of a session devoted to the allocation of funds for infrastructure improvements, a proposal that had originated from a Harrington-aligned planning group was brought to the floor. Where in previous years the family's representative might have been present to speak on its merits, the discussion was instead led by a newly appointed consultant. The proposal passed, but its association with the Harringtons was reduced to a passing reference in the records, as though their role had already receded from relevance. The absence extended into areas where their involvement had been so consistent that it was often taken for granted. The annual review of Boston's maritime operations, published by the Port Authority, did not include the customary acknowledgement of Harrington-managed shipping contracts. Their vessels continued to operate, but the branding that once appeared prominently in harbor reports was omitted. This change did not affect cargo volume or scheduling, yet it removed a visible indicator of their place within the city's commercial framework. Among cultural institutions, the shift was equally clear. The Boston Athenaeum's year-end report for 1888 noted the completion of several acquisitions funded by unnamed patrons. In prior years, the Harrington name had appeared alongside similar entries. Curators who had previously dealt directly with the family now corresponded with administrative staff or with trustees whose identities were unfamiliar. These changes were documented without comment, but they were unmistakable in their cumulative effect. Property transactions during this period also took on a more deliberate pattern. Several holdings in Boston's commercial districts were transferred to investment companies registered in other states. The transactions were completed quietly, without public auction or announcement. Deeds recorded at the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds reveal that in many cases, the buyer's representative and the seller's representative were connected through overlapping boards or partnerships, suggesting that these exchanges were coordinated rather than competitive. In academic circles, the reduction in their direct engagement became more apparent during the winter term of 1888. A series of lectures on urban industrial planning, initially scheduled under the auspices of a college where the Harringtons had a trustee seat, was reorganized with sponsorship from a manufacturing consortium. While the content of the lectures remained unchanged, the absence of the family's name from promotional materials marked a departure from long-standing practice. Faculty members noted the change, but refrained from public comment, perhaps to avoid speculation over the reasons. The family's personal movements during this period are only partially documented. Passenger lists from steamship departures between Boston and New York indicate that certain members traveled more frequently than in earlier years, often without corresponding public engagements in either city. Private hotel registers from New York record their stays under abbreviated or altered versions of the family name, a detail that may have been intended to reduce public notice. Financially, the redistribution of their holdings continued at a measured pace. Brokerage records preserved in private archives show the sale of shares in several regional rail lines, balanced by acquisitions in sectors less directly connected to Boston's infrastructure. This reallocation did not result in any discernible reduction of wealth, but it signaled a move away from industries that had anchored their influence in local affairs. In certain civic projects, their departure was followed by shifts in priorities. A planned modernization of municipal warehouse facilities, which had been advancing under their informal guidance, was postponed pending a new feasibility review. Without their coordination, competing proposals emerged, leading to extended deliberations in committee. Similarly, a cooperative housing initiative they had supported quietly lost momentum after their representatives ceased attending oversight meetings. These changes were not presented as direct consequences of their absence, yet the timing was consistent. What is striking in the archival record is the absence of correspondence explaining these developments. Families of similar stature often left behind letters, diaries, or statements providing insight into strategic decisions. In the case of the Harringtons, the surviving documents from late 1888 and early 1889 are primarily administrative in nature, consisting of receipts, meeting agendas, and property filings. The deliberate omission of commentary suggests either a conscious decision to avoid leaving a written record of intent or a redirection of such discussions into private channels now lost to history. Within the press, their reduced visibility was accompanied by an increase in coverage of other rising figures. Articles in the Boston Evening Transcript that once devoted multiple paragraphs to the family's activities now featured new industrialists or financiers. These replacements were not portrayed as rivals, but their prominence in contexts formerly associated with the Harringtons illustrates the ease with which the public focus shifted. The change was perhaps most evident in the way municipal offices adapted to their absence. In earlier years, projects requiring coordination between multiple departments had often been facilitated by Harrington intermediaries. By the close of 1888, such coordination was handled through standard channels, with no reference to the family's past involvement. This procedural normalization meant that their previous role, though once integral, could be omitted without creating administrative gaps. The final indicator of the transition appears in the 1889 preliminary budget proposals. In the section allocating private contributions to public works, there is no listing under the Harrington name. Contributions were still recorded, but they were assigned to entities whose relationship to the family is unclear. Some may have been affiliated, yet the absence of direct attribution completed the process by which their civic identity was removed from the official record. In retrospect, the pace and consistency of these changes suggest that they were neither accidental nor the result of unforeseen circumstances. The uniformity across multiple sectors points to a coordinated withdrawal, implemented with enough care to avoid public disruption. That it was accomplished without generating speculation in the press at the time speaks to the effectiveness of their methods and the degree of influence they retained even as they stepped back from direct participation. By the opening months of 1889, the mechanisms behind the Harrington family's diminishing public presence began to surface in fragments, preserved in records not intended for broad circulation. These were not declarations of intent, but incidental references embedded within municipal archives, private correspondence, and institutional meeting minutes. Taken individually, they appeared as routine administrative notes. When assembled, they formed a picture of deliberate detachment. One such fragment emerged from the files of the Massachusetts Board of Trade. In January 1889, a memorandum from a senior clerk referred to a realignment of representation for several commercial advisory panels. The memo noted that the Harrington seat would be maintained in name only until the conclusion of the current term, with voting rights delegated to a proxy from an independent consultancy. While such delegation was permissible, it was rare for long-standing members to remove themselves from active participation in this manner. A separate clue came from an internal report at a regional shipping cooperative. The cooperative had counted on the Harrington-managed fleet for regular shipments of manufactured goods. but a mid-year review showed that the family's vessels were no longer under direct contract. Instead, freight was being moved through intermediaries, with the cooperative paying fees to firms based outside Massachusetts. The shift did not affect delivery schedules, yet it altered the contractual structure in a way that distanced the family from operational oversight. Real estate filings during this period reveal further restructuring. Large parcels of land held under the Harrington name were subdivided and transferred to new entities whose ownership structures were opaque. Some of these entities were registered in jurisdictions with less stringent reporting requirements, making it difficult for city assessors to determine the ultimate beneficiaries. Despite these transfers, tax payments remained prompt, and no liens or disputes appear in the records, suggesting that the transactions were fully compliant with legal standards. The academic sector offered additional indications. At a technical institute where the family had funded several facilities, a board meeting in March 1889 included an agenda item regarding the reassignment of unused grant funds. The original donor agreement, signed by a Harrington trustee, had allowed for discretionary use of surplus funds by the institution. This clause was now being invoked for the first time, with the board reallocating the funds toward unrelated projects. The discussion recorded in the minutes made no mention of consultation with the donor, implying that such contact was either unnecessary or no longer feasible. In the cultural sphere, the absence of the family's direct involvement became increasingly apparent. Museum acquisition logs from this period show a reduction in large-scale donations of artifacts or rare volumes. Instead, items previously rumored to be on loan from the Harrington collection were returned to private storage or transferred to smaller, less prominent institutions. The reasons for these transfers are not detailed, but the effect was to remove highly visible markers of the family's presence from public exhibition spaces. Private correspondence between mid-level administrators provides a more candid view of the transition. One letter, preserved in the archives of a Boston bank, describes a meeting with a Harrington representative who explained that future correspondence should be directed to an address in Providence, Rhode Island. The letter notes that no explanation was offered for the relocation of this point of contact, but it speculates that the change was related to streamlining operations across multiple jurisdictions. Even in the legal domain, the adjustments were visible. Court records from Suffolk County show a decline in the number of civil filings involving Harrington enterprises. In earlier years, the family had routinely engaged in litigation related to property disputes, contract enforcement, and commercial regulation. By 1889, such filings had nearly ceased. The remaining cases were handled exclusively by outside counsel, with no personal appearance by family members or long-standing in-house attorneys. Institutional memory within Boston's civic organizations also began to shift. In organizations where the Harringtons had once been active contributors, newer members were often unaware of the family's historical role. Meeting transcripts contain instances in which projects originally initiated under their guidance were discussed without reference to their origins. This erasure was not the result of deliberate omission by any one individual, but rather the natural outcome of replacing participants without maintaining records of prior influence. In the press, the decline in visibility became almost complete. Local papers continued to run articles on the industries in which the Harringtons had been involved, but without attaching their name to developments or innovations. Where once a shipping expansion might have been described as under Harrington management, it was now simply reported as a general improvement in maritime capacity. In effect, the family's activities were being absorbed into the broader narrative of the city's progress, leaving no singular identity attached to their contributions. Economic indicators suggest that this retreat from public engagement did not coincide with a reduction in resources. Banking records, though incomplete, show stable balances and steady income from diversified investments. The family's assets continued to produce returns, but the channels through which those assets were managed became less visible. New intermediaries handled transactions, and the paper trail leading back to the Harringtons was shortened or redirected. The same year brought a final example of their withdrawal from a key public role. A long-standing seat on the oversight board for Boston's public works was vacated mid-term, with the resignation filed quietly through the board's secretary. The resignation letter, preserved in the board's archives, is brief and impersonal, citing personal considerations as the sole reason for departure. No successor from within the family was nominated, and the seat was filled by a candidate from outside their commercial network. The sum of these developments created a situation in which the Harringtons no longer operated as a visible force within Boston's civic or economic life. The institutions they had shaped continued to function, but without their active guidance. Their absence did not produce a crisis, in part because the transition was managed with precision. The records that survive from this period suggest that every reduction in public presence was balanced by an arrangement that ensured continuity, allowing their responsibilities to be absorbed without disruption. In retrospect, the clues to this process were evident only to those with access to multiple sources of information. A municipal clerk might have noticed their absence from committee rosters. A banker might have observed the shift in account management. A curator might have recorded the quiet return of artifacts. Each fragment in isolation could be dismissed as a minor adjustment. Only when viewed together does the pattern emerge, a sustained, deliberate, and almost entirely unremarked withdrawal from the center of Boston's public record. As 1889 progressed into its final quarter, the accumulated traces of the Harrington family's retreat from public affairs became even more embedded in the city's administrative systems. By this stage, the transition no longer resembled a gradual change, but appeared as a fully realized structure in which their prior roles had been completely replaced. The documentary trail that once reflected a complex network of influence now read as if they had never occupied that position. The most visible change appeared in the Boston City Directories for 1890, compiled during the latter part of 1889. For the first time in decades, the Harrington residence on Commonwealth Avenue was listed without any occupational or institutional affiliations attached to the household name. In earlier editions, such entries were accompanied by references to commercial boards, cultural institutions, and philanthropic committees. The new entry contained only the address, reducing their public description to the same format as any private citizen not involved in civic affairs. Institutional records from the Massachusetts Chamber of Commerce reveal an equally decisive shift. At the Chamber's annual meeting in November 1889, a resolution was passed to dissolve a subcommittee on maritime infrastructure that had operated under Harrington guidance for several years. The committee's responsibilities were distributed among other groups, with no mention of its original leadership. The meeting minutes recorded this redistribution as a matter of procedural efficiency, offering no acknowledgement of the structural changes that had made the subcommittee redundant. Further evidence came from the city's property tax rolls. While the Harrington estate continued to be assessed at its customary valuation, multiple commercial properties previously associated with the family were no longer taxed under their name. Instead, the rolls showed a series of small corporations and trusts as the assessed owners. Inquiries into these entities reveal overlapping directors and financial officers, many of whom were unknown in Boston business circles, but shared legal representation with former Harrington enterprises. Cultural institutions followed a similar trajectory. The Boston Athenaeum's donor register for the year contained a single reference to the family, listed under Friends of the Library, with an unspecified contribution amount. This was a marked departure from previous years, when their donations were highlighted with precise figures and accompanied by descriptions of the acquisitions they had funded. Museum catalogues from the same year list several items removed to private collection, without naming the owner, in categories where Harrington contributions had once been prominent. In the financial sector, patterns of consolidation became apparent. Bank ledgers from one of Boston's oldest institutions, now preserved in archival form, show the closing of several accounts long maintained under the Harrington name. The balances from these accounts were transferred in lump sums to out-of-state institutions, most frequently in Rhode Island and New York. These transactions were completed without formal announcements, and the receiving institutions did not carry the Harrington name on any publicly accessible records. Meeting notes from the Boston Board of Education capture another subtle shift. In late 1889, a school construction project in a district where the Harringtons had previously funded scholarships was discussed without reference to their past involvement. Funding for the project was sourced entirely from municipal bonds, with no mention of private contributions. The absence of their name in such a context underscored the degree to which their public association with education had been set aside. Private correspondence from this period, though scarce, occasionally illuminates the operational details behind the withdrawal. One letter from a Boston law office to a client in New York, dated December 1889, references the final transfer of remaining interests to the Providence office and notes that all matters requiring signature will be executed there. While the letter does not explicitly name the Harringtons, cross-referencing the date with property filings confirms that this transfer coincided with the reassignment of one of their largest commercial holdings. Maritime records provide a further glimpse of the structural changes. The Boston Harbor log for autumn 1889 shows that vessels once managed directly under the Harrington fleet name were now listed under a newly incorporated shipping firm headquartered in New Bedford. The ownership structure of this firm is not detailed in surviving documents, but the transfer coincided with the sale of associated warehouse space in Boston's Port District. In operational terms, the fleet continued to function, but its connection to the Harrington name was no longer visible in official channels. The city's press reflected this change by omission. Coverage of civic events in which the family had once participated made no reference to their absence, nor did it speculate on reasons for their withdrawal. This lack of commentary was not unusual for the time, when newspaper reporting often prioritized the activities of those currently in public view rather than investigating the absence of former participants. As a result, the transition occurred in near silence, with only the archival record preserving its outlines. In the private sector, those who had previously worked in close association with the Harringtons adapted quickly to the new arrangement. Business partnerships shifted to align with the newly prominent figures who had stepped into roles once held by the family. Contracts were renegotiated without disruption, and public projects proceeded under revised sponsorship. The speed and smoothness of these adjustments suggest that the withdrawal had been carefully prepared well in advance. Institutional archivists compiling retrospective histories in the years immediately following this period often struggled to account for the sudden change. Reports summarizing the previous decade occasionally referenced a period of administrative transition without further detail. Where earlier annual reports had listed the Harringtons among key contributors, later editions either omitted their name entirely or relegated it to a footnote. The effect was to leave future researchers with a fragmented understanding of their role, dependent on piecing together details from unrelated sources. One of the few surviving first-hand accounts comes from a diary entry written by a mid-level municipal official in December 1889. In it, the writer notes having attended a private meeting at which a representative of the family confirmed that their future activities would not require presence in Boston. The diary does not elaborate on the reasons or the scope of this change, and there is no indication that the information was shared beyond the writer's personal notes. By the close of the year, the withdrawal was complete in functional terms. The Harrington residence remained occupied, but without hosting the gatherings that had once brought together the city's commercial and civic leaders. Their name remained known in Boston, but its appearance in public records had diminished to the point of near invisibility. The institutions and projects they had once shaped continued under new leadership, their prior involvement preserved only in archival traces that were already beginning to fade from common knowledge. In the years immediately following 1889, the absence of the Harrington name from Boston's civic and commercial landscape became a fixed condition rather than a temporary adjustment. New figures occupied the positions they had once held, and municipal documents no longer carried residual references to their involvement. What remained were scattered archival records, occasionally intersecting in ways that hinted at their continued activity beyond the public view. One of the clearest indications of this quiet continuity appeared in the ledgers of a Providence-based trust company. Between 1890 and 1893, substantial deposits were recorded under a series of corporate names that matched those which had appeared on Boston property transfers during the Harrington withdrawal. The accounts showed consistent growth through investment in manufacturing and transportation enterprises located outside Massachusetts. None of these holdings were directly tied to Boston's municipal projects, yet several were connected to regional infrastructure that indirectly benefited the city's trade routes. In the same period, real estate transactions in Rhode Island and Connecticut reveal a coordinated acquisition of warehouse and storage facilities along key railway junctions. Deed registries show these purchases were often made through intermediaries, but the financing originated from entities known to be aligned with the former Harrington commercial network. This pattern suggests that while the family's presence in Boston had receded, their commercial strategy had simply shifted to a broader geographic scope. Academic institutions beyond Boston also began to reflect their influence in ways that differed from their earlier approach. A college in Providence received a substantial endowment for the construction of a new engineering building, funded by a donor trust whose administrative contact was identical to one that had managed Harrington-related projects in the past. The donor name listed in public reports was not Harrington, but the architectural plans bore markings identical to those found in earlier building projects they had overseen in Boston. Cultural organizations in New York similarly benefited from anonymous contributions during this time. Museum catalogs record significant acquisitions in maritime history funded by unnamed patrons. Internal acquisition logs, not intended for public circulation, noted the donor's preference for objects relating to New England's shipping history. The specific focus mirrored the collecting interests of the Harrington matriarch during her years with the Boston Athenaeum, suggesting that her activities in the cultural sphere had continued under conditions of anonymity. Boston itself did not entirely lose contact with the family, though these interactions were limited and often informal. Certain municipal records from the early 1890s show contracts awarded to firms that had historical ties to the Harrington commercial network. While there is no direct evidence of their intervention in these agreements, the recurrence of these firms in city projects indicates that their influence persisted in indirect form. The absence of public acknowledgement during these years created a situation in which their legacy within Boston was no longer actively discussed, even in professional circles. Civic planners who had entered public service after 1890 often treated the Harrington period as a matter of past record, relevant only to earlier phases of the city's development. The institutions that had once relied on their coordination adapted fully to other sources of support, and annual reports from these organizations gradually eliminated references to the family altogether. Private correspondence from former associates in Boston reveals occasional attempts to re-establish contact. A letter preserved in the archives of a legal firm notes an inquiry sent to the Providence office in 1892 regarding potential collaboration on a transportation project. The reply, brief and courteous, declined involvement, while stating that the family's resources were fully committed to ongoing obligations in other jurisdictions. No further correspondence on the matter is recorded. The decision to limit their direct engagement with Boston may have been reinforced by the city's evolving economic structure. The early 1890s saw an increase in industrial consolidation, with large corporations absorbing smaller enterprises in industries the Harringtons had once influenced. Participation in these new corporate structures required public visibility and the disclosure of holdings, both of which conflicted with the increasingly private manner in which the family operated. Despite their absence from civic boards and public works, certain features of Boston's built environment retained the imprint of their earlier involvement. Several street layouts, warehouse districts, and port facilities constructed during their active years remained in operation and continued to serve as integral parts of the city's infrastructure. Municipal records from the time contain no formal recognition of their role in these developments, yet the continuity of use ensured that their earlier decisions continued to shape daily operations. By 1894, their presence in publicly accessible records had diminished to a handful of incidental mentions. The Commonwealth Avenue residence was still listed in city directories, but with no occupational or organizational details. Property tax assessments were paid on time, but always through agents. The residence itself appeared in occasional real estate surveys as an example of well-maintained private architecture, its exterior unchanged from its peak in the late 1880s. Some of the most telling indications of their ongoing activity come from the shipping manifests of firms based outside Boston. Between 1893 and 1896, vessels operated by companies linked to their former maritime network appeared regularly in trade routes connecting New England ports with mid-Atlantic cities. These shipments often included goods produced in factories whose ownership structures mirrored the layered arrangements seen in their Boston holdings. The pattern points to a continuity of commercial logic, even as the geographical focus shifted. Archival notes from the Providence Trust Company in 1895 include references to northern investments, requiring periodic inspection. The accompanying records list properties in Maine and New Hampshire, several of which were later identified as suppliers to Boston merchants. While these holdings were never advertised as Harrington properties, their economic function placed them squarely within the trade systems the family had once directed from Boston. By the mid-1890s, the Harrington name appeared in Boston's newspapers only in the context of personal notices, such as travel departures or the settlement of minor estate matters. These items were brief, providing no context beyond basic facts. The contrast with the extensive coverage of their activities in earlier decades was stark, yet entirely consistent with their chosen absence from public affairs. The absence did not diminish the interest of certain researchers and municipal archivists who continued to encounter traces of their influence when reviewing records from the 1870s and 1880s. Inquiries into land use, commercial planning, and cultural acquisitions from that period frequently led back to their involvement. However, without direct contact or public statements from the family, such inquiries remained academic in nature, producing no official recognition in contemporary reports. By the late 1890s, the Harrington name had settled into a form of quiet endurance. In Boston, their visibility had diminished to the point where only long-standing residents and certain institutional archivists retained a clear memory of their former civic prominence. In other parts of New England, however, their presence was more discernible, particularly in financial and property records linked to transportation, storage, and manufacturing. These documents, though not intended as a public narrative, outlined a network of holdings that mirrored the operational patterns of their earlier Boston years. Trade publications from this period occasionally made indirect reference to firms with organizational structures identical to those the Harringtons had used before their withdrawal. Articles describing expansions of freight capacity in the mid-Atlantic region or improvements to warehouse districts in Rhode Island often mentioned managing boards whose membership was known in private correspondence to be aligned with their commercial advisors. This alignment ensured that while their name was absent, their influence over key logistical systems persisted. Shipping manifests from 1896 revealed that certain New Bedford and Providence-based companies had secured long-term contracts for coastal freight routes. These agreements mirrored earlier arrangements in Boston, with predictable schedules and consistent cargo volumes. The manifests list a variety of goods: manufactured textiles, processed foodstuffs, and finished machinery parts, all of which originated from suppliers situated along railway lines, previously linked to Harrington-managed investments. The operational continuity suggested an economic network designed to function without depending on public identification of ownership. In cultural and educational institutions outside Massachusetts, their approach remained consistent with the methods they had developed in Boston. Endowments continued to appear under trust names, funding library acquisitions, archival preservation, and scholarship programs in fields related to engineering, trade, and maritime history. Internal records from one Rhode Island library note a donor's request that no public acknowledgement be made, a condition which mirrored stipulations found in Boston Athenaeum files from a decade earlier. Back in Boston, indirect connections to their former civic activities occasionally resurfaced through contractual relationships. Municipal procurement records from 1897 show that certain suppliers to the city's infrastructure projects were subsidiaries of larger firms whose investment portfolios included properties managed through the Providence Trust Network. These relationships were rarely detailed in municipal reports, but they ensured a continued, if unspoken, role in shaping Boston's commercial systems. The family residence on Commonwealth Avenue remained intact throughout this period, maintained at a standard consistent with its earlier prominence. Real estate surveys described it as one of the best preserved examples of its architectural style, though it was rarely photographed or included in public exhibitions of the city's historic properties. Tax records indicate that ownership remained stable, with all obligations met promptly through an appointed agent. The residence's unchanged status in official registries contrasted with the transformation of the surrounding neighborhood, where other properties underwent frequent alterations and ownership changes. Archival traces from this time also suggest that the Harringtons maintained private lines of communication with certain individuals still active in Boston's civic planning. A letter preserved in the papers of a former city engineer refers to technical specifications provided from Providence regarding a proposed freight terminal redesign. While the letter does not identify the source by name, the specifications correspond closely to methods employed in projects managed by Harrington representatives in the 1880s. In the academic sector, a technical college in New Hampshire credited an anonymous benefactor with funding the establishment of a mechanical testing laboratory. The design, equipment list, and operational guidelines match those developed in earlier facilities supported by the family in Boston. Faculty correspondence from the time notes the similarity, but refrains from making any direct attribution, suggesting that the connection was understood privately but intentionally left unrecorded. The year 1898 marked the last appearance of the Harrington name in any major Boston publication before the turn of the century. A single notice in a business directory listed a minor property transaction in Suffolk County under the name of a family member, transferring ownership to a holding company based in Connecticut. The transaction was small in scale compared to their earlier undertakings, but it served as a reminder that the family still maintained the capacity to engage directly in the Boston market when desired. Outside of these rare formal entries, the primary record of their continued activity lay in the stability of the systems they had influenced. Railway schedules, port capacities, and commercial supply chains in the region operated in ways that reflected the priorities they had established during their years of public engagement. Even without formal recognition, the infrastructure retained a shape and function that bore the imprint of their earlier coordination. The absence of any significant public return to Boston affairs by the close of the 1890s suggests that the withdrawal was both permanent and deliberate. While other prominent families of the period cycled in and out of public life, depending on circumstance, the Harringtons maintained a clear boundary between their private operations and the city's civic stage. This separation allowed their enterprises to adapt without the obligations or scrutiny that came with visible participation in municipal governance. In historical terms, their departure from public records left a gap that later researchers would find difficult to fill. The dispersal of their commercial activities across multiple jurisdictions, combined with their consistent use of intermediaries, meant that no single archive contained a complete account of their post-1888 operations. Instead, their legacy could only be reconstructed through a comparative study of municipal, corporate, and institutional documents scattered across several states. What remains most notable in reviewing these materials is the deliberate balance between absence and continuity. The Harringtons effectively erased their direct public presence in Boston while maintaining operational structures that ensured the survival and adaptation of their economic network. This approach left little for contemporaries to debate, as there was no visible rupture or controversy to prompt inquiry. In the absence of public explanation, the reasons for their withdrawal became a matter of quiet speculation rather than formal record. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.